President. Now, Mr. President, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that the following Commerce Committee detailees be granted floor privileges for the remainder of Congress: Thomas Hastings, Joseph St. Peter, Tyler Stutton, Dean Legedakis, and Leticia Vega.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. President, for a long time, the United States has benefited from free and competitive global markets. For too long, though, we've relied on the conventional wisdom that engaging with China, and in particular the Chinese Communist Party, by bringing them into the global marketplace would be mutually beneficial. But it's become increasingly obvious, and it's plain as the nose on our face now, that China's primary interest in that so-called free market is to use it to undermine our interests and to further their own. I'm grateful to President Trump for ringing the alarm bells on China and for helping us reframe the way we look at the People's Republic of China. We need to be clear-eyed about exactly what's going on. China is not interested in a level playing field where both parties benefit from a bit of friendly competition. The People's Republic of China is treating competition in the global markets as a zero-sum game where they win and the West loses. Nowhere has this become more apparent than in the case of critical minerals and rare earth elements. I doubt many of us have given a lot of thought, at least in the years past, about the role of rare earth elements and critical minerals, but now we have become educated way too late into the importance of these two elements. There are two ways that a competitive market economy can be undermined. One is excessive government regulation, making it harder for more competitors to enter a market. This makes it more difficult for newer, smaller entrepreneurs to get off the ground. But another way for a competitive market to be threatened is when one seller has a monopoly on a particular good or service. When a single provider of a service or good gets so big that they're the only game in town, then they get to set the terms. A monopoly can ask whatever price they demand because there's no one competing with them for a cheaper or better version. This is precisely what China is doing with respect to mining and processing of rare earth and other critical minerals. But the People's Republic of China takes it one step further. They are actively sabotaging its competitors, including the United States. For a long time, up until the 1980s, the United States dominated the industry for rare earth elements. But then China decided to begin rapidly subsidizing their own rare earth industry. China benefits from some unfortunate advantages in this competition. They have lower labor costs because they're less concerned than we are in the United States about ensuring that workers are paid fairly and kept safe. And we know China has lower environmental standards than we do here in the United States, which further makes it more difficult for the United States to compete against them. But third and most critical advantage that China has over the United States in this field is that their government recognized the importance of these critical minerals a long time ago and was willing to put generous government subsidies in place to launch their industry, while somehow we were lulled into complacency and failed to realize our dependence on China and their processing of critical minerals and rare earth elements. Now, people may be asking, why do we care about critical minerals and rare earth elements? Well, the truth is these elements are essential to producing magnets and other components of our vehicles, our robotics, our aerospace, and our defense systems. We can't build our weapons systems to defend our nation and to deter aggressors without access to these processed rare earth elements and critical minerals. That's how important it is. But China has been successful in sidelining the United States and other global competitors, becoming effectively the only game in town, or I should say, in the world, when it comes to mining and processing these minerals. Well, whether we realized it or not, there's hardly an aspect of our daily life that would not be affected were China to cut off our access to these processed rare earth elements and critical minerals. From our iPhones to the cars we drive, even our washing machines. Because China recognized how important these minerals are, their government is willing to take extraordinary measures to make sure that they control the supply chain for these critical minerals in the future. What are these extraordinary measures that they've taken? Well, over the last 20 years, China has invested $57 billion through state-backed financial institutions in the forms of loans to Belt and Road participant countries in order to gain leverage over the global supply chain for these critical minerals. More than 75% of these investments are structured through joint ventures and special purpose vehicles in such a way that Chinese entities have ownership stakes, allowing them to influence the extraction and processing of these critical mineral projects. More forebodingly, last December, China took steps to ban exports of technologies used in mining and processing rare earth elements in order to exert further control over the supply chain and enhance its leverage when dealing with the United States in various binational negotiations. In April of this year, China placed export controls on 7 rare earth elements, requiring any company that wishes to export them to acquire a special license. And if they didn't, obviously it would be illegal. While the terms and conditions of the licensing process are still being spelled out in more detail, this may become the tool to incentivize various countries to act in China's interest to protect their own access to these minerals. In other words, it's not just the United States that depends on these rare earth elements and critical minerals. It's virtually every other part of the global community. And when China sees likely competitors, it floods the market with excess supply of these minerals, lowering the market price and thereby sidelining any potential competitors. Now, just to be clear, rare earth elements and critical minerals can be mined in many places across the globe. Where China has gotten the monopoly or virtual monopoly is 90% of them are processed in China. So you may mine rare earth elements or critical minerals in Chile or in the United States or Australia or somewhere else, but 90% of them must be processed in China because they're not other competitors for the reasons that I've mentioned. Because China will stop at nothing to manipulate the market, prices have dropped dramatically when they flood the market with processed minerals. Since 2023, for example, cobalt prices decreased 59.5% from $82,000 per ton to $33,000 per ton. Again, because China is manipulating the market to discourage any competition. Nickel prices decreased by 73.1% from $48,000 per ton to $13 per ton. And lithium prices decreased 86.8% from $68,000 to less than $10,000. Consequently, several plants that were designed to open up in the United States to compete with China have had to close because of their inability to maintain profitability in this economic environment. The United States' only cobalt mine opened in 2023 and was forced to close less than a year later when nickel plants in Australia and New Caledonia shut down in the same time frame. And while these competitors have closed their doors, Chinese firms have continued to hold on to their state-sponsored monopoly. China has been taking these steps for decades, right beneath our nose, to develop this near monopoly that they currently hold on mining and processing of critical elements. As the United States, we should have seen this coming, and we could have done something about it, but we didn't. Joe Biden could have spent the last 4 years in the White House tackling this issue head on, but here we are with virtually nothing to show for the Biden administration's so-called efforts. So we're playing catch-up with the Chinese Communist Party, which is not a good place to be. If another pandemic were to happen, disrupting global supply chains, or if we were to find ourselves in a hot war with China, or even difficult trade negotiations with China, which we will, and they decided to cut off trade with the United States, there would be drastic consequences to our economy, to our military preparedness, and to our ability to deter an aggressive Chinese Communist Party. Americans would not be able to purchase the electronics that power our lives day in and day out. Our Department of Defense, or Department of War as it's now called, would be hamstrung in its ability to obtain critical components for the weapon systems that are used to deter aggression by our adversaries. And elderly or chronically ill Americans would be unable to obtain the pharmaceutical remedies they rely upon to simply stay alive. Well, fortunately, while we're late to the game, things are moving now in a better direction under unified Republican control. In March of this year, for example, President Trump issued an executive order directing the Departments of Interior, Defense, or now as it's called, War, Agriculture, and Energy to work together to accelerate domestic investment and production of critical minerals. And Congress also did some things in the One Big Beautiful Bill to help. That legislation included an allocation of $2 billion to the Secretary of War to increase U.S. critical mineral stockpile through the National Defense Stockpile Transaction Fund. And an additional $5 billion was provided for investments in critical minerals through the Industrial Base Fund. Furthermore, this law tightened our definitions of foreign entity of concerns, which will help ensure that Chinese critical mineral companies are not availing themselves of the U.S. tax credits in order to invest in their own critical mineral efforts. While there are ongoing discussions to ensure that the defense authorization bill that we are currently on includes provisions such as the reauthorization of the Development Finance Corporation that our colleagues, Senators Risch and Shaheen, have sponsored this year, we need to make sure they're successful in those efforts. The Development Finance Corporation works to incentivize private capital markets to invest in our most critical supply chains. I've introduced something called the Critical Mineral Security Act, which directs the Department of Interior and Department of State to further identify vulnerabilities in U.S. supply chains for critical minerals. Now, I believe these are important steps, but Mr. President, we have a bigger problem in America. We simply have a hard time building things anymore. A lot of that has to do with overregulation, problems with gaining the appropriate permits, and the litigation environment, which means that any sort of critical infrastructure is probably going to be delayed years, maybe decades, from endless lawsuits. That is a larger, more threatening situation, and I'm only talking about a small part of it here today. The steps we've taken so far are, unfortunately, too little, too late, in my view, but they are at least a step in the right direction. They're not enough by themselves to ensure that we have safe and secure supply chains for both mining and processing of critical minerals to meet our nation's needs. But once again, Deng Xiaoping, who said, "Hide your motives and bide your time," has successfully snookered the United States and our other allies around the world so that we are now almost entirely dependent on Chinese processing of critical minerals. So there's not a day to wait. We need to make sure that we catch up, and we catch up quickly. It's going to take a lot of work for the United States to claw our way back to where we need to be. But I'm confident that we can if we rise to meet the occasion. So I would urge all of my colleagues to listen to and respond to this alarm bell that I'm trying to ring here on the Senate floor today, and take seriously the urgency of securing our supply chains and securing American processing facilities for critical minerals. We simply do not have a choice. Otherwise, we will continue to be held hostage by an adversary that does not wish us well. They don't want friendly competition, they want dominance. And they also want to take Taiwan in the coming years. If we can't build things because we can't deter them by building the weapons necessary to do that, if we can't sustain our economy by continuing to manufacture technology that allows us to compete with China in the coming years, we will have failed in our fundamental responsibility as members of Congress. If America is to have a safe, secure, and prosperous future, we have to compete and we have to win the critical minerals race with the People's Republic of China. Mr. President, I yield the floor.